The jungle was alive with a rhythm of its own. Sunlight filtered through the towering trees, casting golden patches onto the damp forest floor. The air smelled of earth, rain, and the sweet fragrance of wild orchids. Hidden among the dense greenery, creatures stirred, monkeys leaping from branch to branch, brightly colored parrots squawking overhead, and unseen insects humming in the distance. This was not just a place, it was a world, untouched and thriving, where every sound, every rustling leaf, held a story waiting to be told. And among the people who came to study this world was a young girl named Mia. Unlike most children her age, Mia did not grow up surrounded by city streets or schoolyards. Instead, the jungle was her home. Her parents, both dedicated wildlife researchers, had spent years traveling across the world, studying animals in their natural habitats. This time, their work had brought them deep into the heart of a remote jungle, a place where humans were rare and nature ruled. Mia was used to adventure. She had followed her parents into forests and mountains, watched them study creatures big and small, but there was something different about this place, something that made her heart beat a little faster. It wasn't just the beauty of the jungle, it was a feeling, a sense that something was waiting for her here, something life-changing. You've been reading that book about gorillas for weeks now, Mia. Maybe it's time you meet the real thing. Mia looked up from the worn pages of her book, her eyes lighting up with excitement. She had spent hours memorizing every detail about the great apes, their strength, their intelligence, their gentle nature. She had imagined what it would be like to see them in the wild, but now, for the first time, that dream was about to become real. She grabbed her notebook, her hands shaking with anticipation as she followed her parents into the jungle. The familiar trails around their research camp quickly disappeared, swallowed by thick vines and towering trees. Every step she took was careful, her boots pressing into the damp earth, her ears tuned to the sounds around her. A monkey chattered in the distance, the wind whispered through the branches, and somewhere, hidden in the depths of the jungle, a pair of watchful eyes followed her every move. What was that? Come, Mia. It's time for you to meet the kings of the jungle. And with those words, Mia felt her heart pound. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to meet someone who would change her life forever. The jungle was full of movement, yet in that moment, everything seemed to still. Mia's breath hitched as she stood frozen, her fingers tightening around the strap of her backpack. Through the thick foliage, a shadow shifted, slow and deliberate. Then, from behind the broad leaves, he emerged. A massive silverback gorilla, his dark fur gleaming under the dappled sunlight, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers. He was larger than she had ever imagined, his presence both powerful and silent. Her heart pounded, her mind racing between awe and fear. The gorilla did not move. He only watched. His broad chest rose and fell in steady rhythmic breaths, his gaze filled with something Mia couldn't quite place. Curiosity, caution, challenge. She wanted to take a step back, but her feet remained rooted in place. Every instinct told her to run, to turn and disappear into the trees. But she knew better. She had read about gorillas, studied them for as long as she could remember. Sudden movements could be seen as a threat, and running was the worst thing she could do. Her mind screamed at her to stay calm, to hold still. Her fingers trembled slightly as she swallowed hard, keeping her eyes soft, her posture relaxed. The gorilla exhaled, a deep, slow sound that sent a shiver down her spine. He blinked once, then again, his expression unreadable. Mia could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was not just an encounter. It was something more, something rare. A moment of connection between two very different worlds. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The gorilla tilted his head ever so slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. Then, as if deciding she was no threat, he lowered himself onto his knuckles, his muscles rippling as he turned his head, looking past her, as if she were just another creature of the jungle. The tension in her chest eased just a little, though her hands still felt clammy. Slowly, cautiously, she let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her parents had told her about moments like this, moments when an animal accepts your presence, acknowledges you without fear or aggression. But nothing in the world could have prepared her for the way it felt, for the way her heart swelled with something she couldn't name. The gorilla, this mighty ruler of the jungle, had given her something precious: trust. A soft rustling in the bushes made her glance away for just a second, and when she looked back, he was already moving, his massive frame disappearing into the thick green maze of the jungle. Mia stood there, motionless, her fingers still curled around the straps of her backpack. She wanted to call out, to follow, to understand more, but she knew this was not the last time she would see him. The days that followed were unlike any Mia had ever experienced. Every morning, she found herself drawn back to the same place, her heart pounding with both excitement and uncertainty. She didn't know if the gorilla would return, but something deep inside told her he would. And so, she waited. She sat quietly near the towering trees, her eyes scanning the dense foliage, listening to the jungle's whispers. Hours passed, but she didn't mind. And then, just when she started to wonder if he was truly gone, she heard it. A low rustle, a shadow shifting between the leaves. There he was, the silverback, emerging once more, his dark eyes locking onto hers just as they had the first time. But this time, something was different. The fear that had once tightened her chest was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet understanding. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply watched as he stepped forward, his massive hands pressing against the damp earth. He was closer now, close enough that she could see the details in his fur, the creases around his eyes, the gentle rise and fall of his breath. He was watching her just as much as she was watching him. Carefully, Mia reached into her backpack and pulled out a small handful of fruit. Bananas, soft berries, things she had seen the jungle provide. Slowly, she extended her hand, her palm open, offering a silent invitation. The gorilla didn't react at first. He only stared, as if weighing the moment, deciding whether he could trust this strange small creature in front of him. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he took a step forward. His fingers, thick and powerful, yet incredibly precise, reached out and plucked a berry from her hand. He didn't snatch it, didn't rush. Instead, he examined it for a second before placing it in his mouth, chewing slowly. Mia's breath hitched in wonder. He had accepted her offering. He had accepted her. Day after day, she returned, never forcing their connection, always letting him decide the pace. Some days, he would sit nearby, watching her as she sketched in her notebook. Other times, he would completely ignore her, as if testing whether she would grow impatient and leave. But she never did. She stayed, listening, learning. She mimicked the gentle grunts he made, the subtle movements of his hands, and slowly he began to respond. He would grunt back, shift closer, reach out to touch objects she brought with her, a piece of fabric, a small wooden carving her father had given her. She had always read about how intelligent gorillas were, but witnessing it firsthand was something entirely different. This was not just an animal. He was something more, thoughtful, emotional, aware, and in some unspoken way, he was letting her in. One afternoon, as she sat with her notebook open, the gorilla did something that made her heart stop. He reached out, ever so gently, and touched the pages of her sketches. His massive fingers brushed over the lines she had drawn, pictures of him, his troop, the jungle they called home. Mia held her breath, watching as he stared at the images, and then, to her surprise, he looked at her. Really looked at her. As if, in that moment, he finally understood. She wasn't just an observer, she was a friend. Mia's bond with the silverback deepened in ways she never could have imagined. Each day, their silent understanding grew stronger. The gorilla no longer watched her from a distance. He welcomed her presence. He allowed her to sit near him as he foraged, to observe his every movement without suspicion. Sometimes, he would even reach out, brushing his fingers against her arm, his touch surprisingly gentle for a creature of such immense strength. It was as if he saw her not as a stranger, but as something familiar, something safe. One morning, as Mia made her way through the dense jungle, she noticed something different. The silverback wasn't alone. A few feet behind him, half hidden in the foliage, a smaller figure peeked out. A young gorilla, no older than a few months, clung to its mother's fur, its wide eyes filled with both curiosity and uncertainty. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She knew what this meant. The silverback, the leader of his troop, was allowing her to see his family. It was a sign of trust greater than anything she had hoped for. She lowered herself onto the ground slowly, making sure not to move too fast. The mother gorilla eyed her cautiously, but did not retreat. The infant, emboldened by curiosity, let go of its mother for a brief moment, taking an unsteady step toward Mia. A small giggle bubbled in her chest, but she held it in, not wanting to startle them. Instead, she simply extended her hand, palm up, just as she had done with the silverback. The little gorilla hesitated, then reached out, its tiny fingers brushing against hers for a split second before scrambling back to its mother's side. It was a fleeting moment, but one that sent a rush of warmth through Mia's entire being. The silverback watched the exchange, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, with a slow exhale, he shifted his massive body, moving closer than he ever had before. Mia could feel the weight of his presence, the power he carried with every breath. Yet, there was no fear, only understanding. He reached forward, his fingers skimming the edge of her notebook once again. But this time, he didn't stop there. Instead, with surprising gentleness, he tapped his own chest before tapping the page where Mia had drawn him days before. Her throat tightened with emotion. It was as if he was acknowledging himself in her art, recognizing the connection she had put onto paper. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, smiling instead. She placed her hand against her own chest, mirroring his gesture, then lightly tapped the sketch once more. A quiet moment passed between them before the silverback huffed softly, almost like a sigh of contentment. Mia had no words for what had just happened, but she knew, deep in her heart, that she had been accepted in a way few humans ever were. She was no longer just an outsider. She was part of his world now. The jungle had become more than just a home. It was a place of belonging, a world where words were unnecessary, where trust was built through quiet moments and unspoken understanding. Mia spent her days with the gorillas, learning their ways, mimicking their sounds, and observing the delicate balance of their lives. The silverback no longer saw her as a visitor. He allowed her to sit beside him as he rested, to watch as he led his troop through the dense foliage. And in return, Mia gave him something just as valuable: companionship, a connection that crossed the invisible barrier between human and animal. One afternoon, as Mia sat sketching in her notebook, she felt a sudden stillness in the air. The jungle, always alive with noise, had gone eerily quiet. The silverback lifted his head, nostrils flaring as he caught a scent carried by the wind. Mia followed his gaze and saw them, strangers, moving through the trees with an unnatural presence. They weren't researchers. They weren't supposed to be here. And the way the silverback tensed, his muscles coiled with quiet alarm, told Mia exactly what they were: poachers. Her heartbeat quickened as she crouched low, pressing herself against the thick roots of a tree. The men carried rifles slung over their shoulders, their eyes scanning the jungle like predators hunting prey. She had read about this, heard the stories of gorilla families being torn apart by greed, of their kind being taken or killed for reasons that made no sense. And now, standing in front of her, was that very threat. The silverback let out a low, rumbling growl, a warning that vibrated through the air, but the men didn't back away. One of them lifted his rifle, pointing it toward the trees. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She had to act. She couldn't let them hurt him, couldn't let them destroy everything she had come to love. Without thinking, she stood up, stepping into their line of sight. "Stop!" Her voice rang out, strong despite the fear clawing at her chest. The men startled, clearly not expecting to see a young girl in the middle of the jungle. She took a step forward, raising her hands. "You don't belong here. These gorillas are protected. If you harm them, the authorities will find you." She hoped her voice carried the conviction she needed. The silverback watched her, his deep eyes unreadable, but he did not move. He was trusting her. For a tense moment, the poachers hesitated. Then, one of them scoffed, lowering his rifle. "Not worth it," he muttered, turning to leave. The others followed, disappearing into the jungle as quickly as they had come. Mia stood there, her legs trembling, her breath coming in uneven gasps. The silverback exhaled deeply, his massive shoulders relaxing just slightly. And then, as if in silent gratitude, he reached out and brushed his fingers lightly against her arm. A simple touch, but one filled with meaning. She had protected him, just as he had, in his own way, protected her. The jungle slowly came back to life, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves returning as if the moment of danger had never happened. But Mia knew things had changed. Their bond, already strong, had deepened into something unbreakable. She had come to the jungle as a visitor, a girl with a heart full of wonder. But now she was more than that. She was part of its story, woven into the life of a creature who had shown her the true meaning of trust, of friendship, of love beyond words. The days that followed felt different, as if the jungle itself had shifted. The silverback no longer just accepted Mia. He welcomed her. The gentle moments they shared became more frequent. He would sit closer, watching her sketch with quiet fascination. Sometimes, he would even nudge a fallen leaf toward her, as if offering his own kind of art. The younger gorillas, once hesitant, now played freely around her, tugging at her shoelaces, trying to mimic her movements. It was a life she never wanted to leave, a world so pure, so untouched by the chaos beyond the trees. But deep down, she knew the moment she dreaded was coming. Her parents had told her from the beginning, this was temporary. Their research here would soon be complete, and they would have to leave. The thought of saying goodbye felt unbearable. She had found something rare, something she might never experience again. And worse, she feared what would happen to the silverback and his family once she was gone. Would the poachers return? Would the jungle still be safe for them? She sat beside the silverback one evening, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and pink. He exhaled deeply, his massive frame relaxed as he gazed into the distance. Mia hesitated, then reached out, placing her palm gently on his arm. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his head, his deep eyes meeting hers. There was an understanding there, one that didn't need words. He knew. He always knew. A lump formed in her throat as she whispered, "I have to go soon." The words felt foreign, wrong, but saying them out loud made it real. The silverback blinked slowly, his gaze steady, unshaken, and then, in the simplest, most powerful gesture, he reached out and tapped her chest. Just once, right over her heart. Mia's breath caught. He was telling her what she already knew. Their bond wasn't bound by distance. It wasn't something that could be broken. She would carry him with her, no matter where she went. The night before they left, Mia made a promise. She sat by the fire, notebook in hand, writing a letter, a plea to conservationists, to wildlife protection agencies, to anyone who could help. She detailed everything she had witnessed, the beauty of this gorilla family, the dangers they faced. She wouldn't let them become just another statistic, another loss to human greed. If she couldn't stay, she would make sure the world knew their story. When the morning came, the silverback and his troop stood at a distance, watching as Mia and her parents packed their belongings. She wanted to run to him one last time, to hold on to the moment a little longer. But she knew he wouldn't understand why she was leaving, and that made it even harder. Instead, she turned, placing her hand over her heart, the way he had done. He watched her, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't name, something that would stay with her forever. As the jungle faded behind her, Mia wiped away a tear and whispered, "I'll come back, I promise." The days away from the jungle felt like a dream she had woken up from too soon. The rhythm of the city was loud, overwhelming, nothing like the quiet understanding she had shared with the silverback. Mia went through her daily life, but her mind was never far from him. Every sound of rustling leaves, every image of deep green forests, pulled her back to the place where she had left a piece of her heart. But she had made a promise, not just to him, but to herself. She couldn't let the jungle be just a memory. She poured herself into her mission, reaching out to conservation groups, wildlife organizations, anyone who would listen. She shared her story, her experience, her fears about the dangers the gorillas still faced. And slowly, her voice was heard. Awareness grew, and with it, a movement. People started paying attention. Funds were raised. Protection efforts in the area strengthened. And though she was miles away, she felt as if, in some way, she was still standing beside the silverback, fighting for him. Then, one day, the opportunity she had been waiting for finally arrived. A conservation group, inspired by her passion, invited her to return, to see firsthand the difference she had helped make. Her heart pounded as she stepped off the small plane, the humid jungle air wrapping around her like an old friend. Every step through the dense green paths felt like walking into a story she thought had ended, but was merely continuing. And then she saw him. He stood there, just as strong, just as magnificent as she remembered. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, time ceased to exist. Would he remember? Did he still know her? The answer came not in words, but in a single movement. The silverback stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his massive frame towering over her. And then, just as he had all those months ago, he reached out and gently tapped her chest. Mia's breath hitched, a wave of emotions swelling inside her. He remembered. He had never forgotten. She pressed her own hand to her heart just as he had taught her. This was more than a reunion. It was proof that love, trust, and friendship could transcend time and distance. She had come back, not just to see him, but to ensure that his world, his home, would remain safe, now and for the future. And as she stood there, surrounded by the sounds of the jungle, she knew that some bonds could never be broken.